I noticed the problem before anyone else, because I was the only one still watching the tension readout instead of the water. The gauge didn't spike or drop. It began to sway, slow and rhythmic, like it was sinking with something below us rather than resisting it. I remember thinking it was fatigue, or maybe I was, because we'd been lifting blind for 12 hours straight. That's when the supervisor leaned over and said there were 11 strange rules I had to follow if I wanted to finish the shift alive, and I laughed because it sounded like a joke told too late. I stopped laughing when I realized I'd already broken one and couldn't remember when. The first time I learned Rule 1, never acknowledge movement in the cable unless someone else mentions it first. I was standing alone in the crane cab with my gloves off, rubbing oil into a blister that wouldn't heal. The cable had been lowered past visual range for hours, and the only thing keeping me company was the slow crawl of numbers across a screen that never blinked. I didn't notice the movement at first because it wasn't dramatic or sudden, just a mild disagreement between what my eyes saw and what my hands felt through the controls. When the supervisor's voice came through the headset and told me the rule like it was a courtesy instead of a warning, I realized everyone else already knew. I didn't respond right away because acknowledging anything on the rig usually meant paperwork, inspections, and lost time. Silence was the currency offshore, and the less you disturbed it, the longer your shift stayed predictable. The supervisor didn't repeat himself, but he stayed on the line, breathing evenly, waiting to see what I would do. That waiting pressed harder on my chest than the movement itself, which was still happening in a way I couldn't name without breaking the rule I'd just been given. I finally said I understood, even though I didn't, and the line went dead immediately. Once the channel closed, the cab felt smaller, like the walls had shifted a few inches inward while I wasn't looking. I tried to convince myself that the sensation in the controls was just fatigue, the kind that sneaks up after too many consecutive night shifts. My hands hovered over the levers, unsure whether correcting the tension would count as acknowledgement or instinct. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to glance at the secondary readout that was flickering just slightly off rhythm. The longer I pretended nothing was happening, the more convinced I became that something was paying attention to my pretending. Out on the deck below, the crew moved with their usual careless precision, boots clanging, voices raised against the wind. No one looked up at the cable, which should have reassured me, but instead made my skin crawl. If the movement were normal, someone would have cursed about it or called for a pause. If it were mechanical, alarms would have already forced the issue. The fact that no one reacted made me feel like I was the only person standing in the wrong reality. I adjusted the chair and leaned back, trying to put physical distance between myself and the thought that the cable felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just wrong in a way that didn't translate into numbers. The crane responded to my smallest inputs with delayed obedience, like it was waiting to see if I meant it. I remembered another operator once telling me the crane had moods, and we'd laughed about it over instant coffee. Sitting there now, I couldn't remember if that conversation had ended with a punchline or a warning. The supervisor had chosen his words carefully, and that bothered me more the longer I sat with them. He hadn't said the cable might move or could move, but had spoken as if movement were a given, something inevitable that only became dangerous once named. That meant the rule wasn't about safety in the traditional sense. It was about participation, about refusing to complete some kind of unspoken loop. I wondered how many times I'd already completed it without realizing. A slight tremor ran through the control column, subtle enough that I could have dismissed it if I wanted to. My first instinct was to call it out, to share the burden of noticing, but the memory of the supervisor's calm voice stopped me. I swallowed the words before they formed, feeling ridiculous for being afraid of something so abstract. The crane cab smelled faintly of metal and old sweat, and the air felt thicker than it had an hour earlier. I kept my mouth shut and focused on breathing evenly. Time began to stretch in uncomfortable ways, minutes expanding until I checked the clock twice to confirm it was still moving. The cable's tension shifted again, this time accompanied by a faint vibration that traveled up through the frame and into my feet. I pressed my boots flat against the floor, grounding myself, reminding my body where it was. The urge to acknowledge the movement grew stronger the longer I resisted it, like an itch that spread when scratched mentally instead of physically. I started to understand that the rule wasn't just about silence, but about endurance. I thought about the operators who had trained me, most of them gone now to other rigs or early retirements. None of them had mentioned rules like this, but they had shared stories that ended abruptly, with phrases like, "After that I transferred," or "I don't work nights anymore." At the time I'd assumed burnout or family reasons. Now those half-finished stories took on a different shape, like negative space revealing an outline. It made me wonder how many people had noticed movement and spoken first. Another shift in tension pulled my attention back to the present, sharper than before, insistent. My hand twitched toward the radio, muscle memory trying to override caution. I imagined the relief of saying something out loud, of having someone else confirm I wasn't imagining it. But the rule hovered between me and that relief, heavy and undefined. I clenched my jaw and let the moment pass without comment, feeling a strange mix of pride and shame at my restraint. The longer I stayed quiet, the more isolated I felt from the rest of the rig, as if my silence had placed me behind glass. I could see everyone, hear them faintly, but I was no longer fully part of their world. The cable continued its subtle disobedience, moving in ways that suggested intention without revealing it. I began to suspect that acknowledgement wasn't about alerting others, but about being acknowledged in return. That thought made my throat tighten. I checked the logbook, flipping through entries from earlier shifts, looking for anything that might validate what I was experiencing. The notes were dry and technical, full of routine checks and weather updates. Nothing mentioned movement beyond acceptable parameters. That absence felt deliberate, like a collective agreement to leave certain things unrecorded. I closed the book slowly, careful not to make noise, as if the cab itself were listening. When the supervisor finally checked back in, his voice was casual, almost bored, and he asked how things were holding. I answered with the approved phrases, reporting stable readings and steady conditions. He didn't ask about the cable, and I didn't offer anything beyond what was required. The conversation ended without resolution, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I realized then that following the rule didn't make things better, it just delayed something I couldn't see. As my shift wore on, the movement became a constant companion, never escalating enough to force action, never stopping long enough to forget. I learned to hold my body still, to breathe shallowly, to avoid any behavior that might be interpreted as acknowledgement. It was exhausting in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. The cab felt less like a workplace and more like a test chamber. I started counting the hours not until relief, but until something changed. By the time my replacement arrived, I was trembling with a fatigue that felt older than the shift itself. We exchanged the usual brief handover, careful and impersonal. I watched his eyes flick to the controls, then away, and I wondered what he felt through his hands. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. As I stepped out of the cab, the cable shifted once more, just enough to let me know it remembered me. I learned Rule 2. If the cable slackens without command, you must not correct it for 60 seconds. At the exact moment my replacement's hands closed around the controls I had just let go of. The transfer should have been routine, but the tension readout dipped the instant I stepped back, like the machine knew there was someone new touching it. He frowned, instinctively reaching to compensate, and I felt my stomach drop before I could stop him. I told him to wait, my voice sharper than intended, and he looked at me like I'd insulted his competence. The look on his face told me he thought I was messing with him, not saving him. He asked why, and I didn't answer right away because explaining would have meant admitting the slackening was real. The seconds stretched as the cable eased downward on its own, not fast enough to trigger alarms, but enough to feel intentional. I held up one finger, then another, silently counting, while he watched the gauge with growing irritation. The cab seemed to tilt slightly, though I knew that was impossible, and my pulse kept time with the drifting needle. When the minute finally passed, I nodded, and only then did he correct the slack, jaw tight with unasked questions. We didn't talk about it after that. not during the walk to the mess or over the stale coffee that tasted like rust. He avoided my eyes, and I couldn't blame him, because I didn't want to see my own reflection in his confusion. The rule had come to me not as a warning, but as a memory, something I realized I already knew once the situation demanded it. That realization unsettled me more than the cable's behavior. It suggested these rules weren't learned, but remembered. On my way to the quarters, the rig felt subtly different, like a place I'd visited too many times in a dream. The corridors seemed longer, the hum of machinery more intimate, closer to the ear than usual. I replayed the moment of slackening in my head, trying to decide if it had been a test or a signal. The fact that nothing immediately terrible had happened didn't reassure me. It only meant the consequences were patient. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was shallow and crowded with half-formed images. I dreamed of the cable looping back on itself, nodding into shapes that felt meaningful without being recognizable. Each time I tried to pull away, the slack increased, drawing me closer instead. I woke with my hands clenched, nails biting into my palms, and the lingering sense that I'd missed something important by waking up too soon. The clock told me I'd only slept an hour. Back on shift, the cab felt colder, though the temperature readout hadn't changed. The cable hung steady at first, almost mocking in its obedience. I told myself the previous shift had primed me to see patterns where there were none. That confidence lasted exactly until the tension dropped again, slow and deliberate, without any input from me. My muscles locked, every instinct screaming to correct it, but the memory of the rule held me in place. Those 60 seconds felt longer than the entire night before. I counted them with my breath, afraid to move too much in case motion itself counted as interference. The slack deepened just enough to make the crane feel unbalanced, like standing on a deck that doesn't quite match the horizon. Somewhere below, out of sight, whatever we were lifting shifted its weight in response. I realized then that the rule wasn't about safety margins or mechanical limits. It was about allowing something else to finish what it had started. When I finally corrected the slack, the response traveled up the cable in a way that felt almost conversational. Not resistance, exactly, but acknowledgement, like a nod returned after a pause. I sat back, heart pounding, and forced myself to log the adjustment as routine. The act of writing it down felt dishonest, but also necessary, like participating in a shared lie that kept the rig functioning. I wondered how many of the logs around me were similar compromises. Later that day, a junior rigger stopped by the cab under the pretense of checking a sensor. He lingered longer than necessary, eyes darting to the cable and back. Without looking at me, he asked if I'd ever felt like the crane was waiting. The question was casual, but his grip on the railing was tight enough to whiten his knuckles. I shrugged, giving him the safest answer I could manage. He nodded, relief and disappointment crossing his face in quick succession. As the hours passed, I became hyper-aware of every minor fluctuation, every hesitation in the machinery. The rule forced me into a kind of enforced passivity that gnawed at my sense of control. I wasn't preventing failure, I was delaying response, letting events unfold on someone else's terms. That shift in responsibility weighed on me, heavier than any load we'd lifted. It made me complicit in whatever was happening below. At one point, the slackening happened while a supervisor was in the cab with me, watching over my shoulder. I felt the familiar drop in tension and froze, counting silently. He noticed my stillness before he noticed the gauge, and his expression hardened. He didn't ask what I was doing, just waited, eyes fixed on the readout. When I corrected the slack after the minute passed, he exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath the whole time. After he left, I sat alone with the hum of the cab, feeling older than I had that morning. The rule had changed how I interacted with the crane, turning each adjustment into a moral choice rather than a technical one. I started to understand that these weren't rules designed to keep us alive in the traditional sense. They were rules that defined the terms of our involvement. Break them, and you asserted control. follow them, and you accepted something else's. By the end of the shift, the cable behaved perfectly, almost courteously. That scared me more than the slackening ever had. It felt like a reward, and I didn't trust rewards given without explanation. As I powered down the controls and prepared to leave, the tension gauge dipped one last time, just barely perceptible, like a reminder. I stood there, hands at my sides, waiting out the minute in silence, even though no one was watching. I learned Rule 3. Always check the cable alignment from both the control panel and the deck before initiating a lift, after the shift that had started to blur the edges of night and day. I was alone, crouched over the monitor, squinting at the thin lines of tension and angle, trying to make sense of discrepancies that didn't exist on paper. Someone on the deck had called out a minor wobble earlier. An instinct had told me it wasn't important, but the rule had been echoing in my head ever since. That single misalignment, small as it seemed, could have undone everything we'd been trying to stabilize for weeks. I felt my palms slick, the reflection of my own hands on the glass, showing a subtle tremor I hadn't noticed until now. Walking down to the deck, the rig smelled of salt, oil, and damp metal in a way that always made me think of lungs filling with something denser than air. My boots hit the steel plates softly, deliberately, and I avoided eye contact with anyone passing by. I didn't need to explain why I was checking the alignment from both places. The crane itself seemed to watch for excuses. The cable didn't shift while I stood there, but the tiniest miscalculation would have meant letting an unseen weight swing unchecked below us. I leaned over the edge, tracking its line, confirming the angles against my own eyes, and felt a subtle unease at how precise everything suddenly seemed. Back at the control panel, I repeated the same measurements, letting the monitors and gauges confirm what my eyes and hands had already told me. Even though the lines appeared perfect now, the memory of ignoring a wobble on the deck made my stomach twist. Following this rule wasn't just about preventing a mechanical error, it was about acknowledging an unspoken hierarchy between what could be seen and what could be felt. Every readout, every gauge flicker, felt like a conversation with a machine that was infinitely patient and judgmental in equal measure. When the deck supervisor came over, he didn't comment on my repeated checks, just nodded toward the monitor as if he could see into the same tension that I was now obsessively measuring. That simple nod carried weight. It reminded me that following the rule wasn't simply precaution, it was survival. Not acknowledging misalignment in both perspectives could invite error, or worse, something that the crane would refuse to forgive. I felt the subtle pressure of responsibility pressing down on my shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with physical load. The wind shifted, pushing the crane gently, though it seemed heavier than it should have been. I sensed every minuscule change through my fingertips on the control levers, and my vision darted between the deck and the panel repeatedly. The cable didn't just carry weight, it carried the accumulated tension of hours, of prior mistakes, of anticipations that only someone awake and alert could feel. The more I focused, the more the crane seemed to align itself with my own mental rhythm. I realized then that ignoring a misalignment was not just a technical error, it was a moral compromise that the rig recognized. When we began the lift, everything felt deceptively smooth. The cable rose, slow and steady, but my gaze constantly flicked between the panel and the deck. Each check confirmed the alignment, yet each confirmation seemed to reveal something different. A slight sway that hadn't been there a second ago, a fraction of a degree in angle that made me bite my lip. I whispered the rule to myself quietly, a reminder that the crane might respond to thought as much as to action. The day was long, but every repetition of this check became a meditation on control, precision, and trust. I noticed the junior rigger watching me, hesitating, uncertain whether to intervene or simply observe. I didn't answer his look, but it was clear he understood that the rule wasn't arbitrary. My lips pressed together as I followed my own procedure, and the cable obeyed, or at least seemed to in ways that I couldn't quantify but felt viscerally in my chest. The alignment wasn't just about physical danger, it was about the subtleties of movement and perception. about noticing before being forced to react. I felt a tension in my mind mirroring the one in the cable, both coiled tightly and waiting. Halfway through the lift, a subtle vibration traveled up from the base, almost like a pulse beneath the steel floor. I froze for a heartbeat, letting my eyes follow the cable line from deck to panel without touching a single control. It wasn't an emergency, but it reminded me why the rule existed. The crane didn't forgive assumptions, and the cable didn't allow shortcuts in perception. That tiny misalignment would have cascaded into a failure that no one could reverse once it started. I held my breath until the rhythm passed, waiting to see if the vibration would repeat, and it didn't, but the memory lingered. Later, the supervisor pulled me aside, quietly emphasizing the importance of maintaining dual observation. I didn't argue. The lesson had been absorbed, etched into muscle memory and attention. Even in mundane lifts, the crane's subtle reactions could teach you things manuals never mentioned. The alignment check wasn't just a safety measure, it was a practice of awareness, a demonstration that small patient observation could avert catastrophe. Each repetition carried weight, though the monitors never said it out loud, and the deck never whispered confirmation. By the end of the shift, I was exhausted, not from the physical labor, but from maintaining the mental equilibrium demanded by Rule 3. Each check, each glance, felt like a negotiation with something that wasn't just machinery but presence. As I left the cab, the cable hung perfectly aligned, obedient in its own way, but I felt the residue of tension in my chest, a reminder that compliance alone was never enough. Someone or something below had noticed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that acknowledgement was always a step too late. I remember the first time Rule 4. Never adjust the cable under pressure. If you feel hesitation, no matter how small, became more than a phrase memorized from an old supervisor's mouth. It was a lesson carved into the rhythm of my heartbeat during a stormy night on the rig. The wind had picked up suddenly, turning the deck into a slippery battlefield, and the crane swayed more than usual, pendulums of steel and tension, threatening to snap every certainty I held. I had a split second to react as the cable jerked violently, but my mind screamed to wait. Hesitation felt like betrayal, but it was also survival, and acknowledging it might have saved me from crossing an invisible line I didn't even know existed. I gripped the levers, sweat slicking the palms of my gloves, my eyes darting between the top of the cable and the shadowed deck below. Each instinct I had told me to compensate immediately, to yank, to stabilize, to force order where chaos had begun. But the memory of the rule anchored me, reminding me that any action born of panic was already a mistake. I could feel the subtle tremor of the cable, almost sentient in its defiance, as if it knew that my hesitation was not weakness, but an invitation. I held myself steady, silent, my throat tight with the effort of doing nothing. Minutes stretched, elongated into something impossible. As the rig's systems hummed with a sound I could feel through the steel soles of my boots. Each swing of the cable was deliberate, teasing me, testing whether my restraint would last. I swallowed against the dryness in my mouth, telling myself the rule existed to prevent rash errors. But deep down I feared that inaction might be even more dangerous. The hesitation wasn't just a fleeting thought, it was a mirror of the crane itself, reflecting what I was capable of and what I was not. From the deck I could see the junior rigger frozen beside the base of the crane, eyes wide as he watched the cable tremble. He muttered something under his breath about the wind, or maybe the load, but I didn't answer, not yet. The rule had taught me that speaking or acting too soon could escalate something subtle into catastrophe. I clenched my jaw and counted breaths, listening to the steel and the subtle shifts it made, and I realized that this waiting was not passive. It was an active negotiation with forces I couldn't name. After what felt like an eternity but was only a handful of heartbeats, the cable settled slightly, enough to ease the immediate threat. I exhaled slowly, aware that the rule had guided me, but also knowing it was fragile guidance, dependent entirely on my discipline. Every instinct screamed at me to correct, to intervene, to take control, but I remained motionless, hands hovering just above the levers. The crane seemed to acknowledge me in its own way, not with gratitude, but with recognition that I had learned to defer, to let hesitation be a buffer, a measure of safety. Even when the storm eased, the residual tension remained, a vibration I could feel in my bones. I replayed the moment over and over, noticing how small the hesitation had been at first, almost imperceptible, but enough to mark the boundary between life and error. The cab felt smaller, tighter, as though holding me accountable for every thought. Following the rule wasn't comforting. It was like a subtle litmus test for every decision I'd ever made on the rig. I wondered how many other times I'd acted without hesitation, blindly ignoring that invisible gauge. By the time I stepped away, boots clanging softly on the deck, I understood that Rule 4 wasn't just about timing or mechanical precision. It was about restraint in the face of instinct, about listening to the internal tremors that told you something was not yet ready to be touched. Acting too soon could destroy more than the cable or the lift. It could unravel the fragile balance of awareness, the silent conversation between operator and machine. I left the cab feeling both accomplished and unsteady, knowing that hesitation had saved me, but the cost of that lesson lingered like a shadow I could not shake. Even hours later, as I recorded the tension logs in the main system, I felt the memory of that hesitation creeping into my pulse. The rule wasn't written in manuals or highlighted in training. It existed in the silence between actions, in the pause that felt wrong until it proved necessary. I could still see the cable swinging in slow arcs, the way it had tested my resolve, and I realized that these moments of enforced stillness were more dangerous than sudden jerks or wind gusts. Doing nothing under pressure was the hardest action I had ever mastered, and I knew that the crane, the rig, the storm, and something beneath the water were all watching to see if I remembered. By the time the rest of the crew returned to their posts, the tension had normalized, the rig humming with routine life as if nothing had occurred. But I knew differently. Rule 4 had imposed its weight quietly, subtly, reshaping the way I moved, breathed, and thought. And though nothing else had gone wrong during that lift, the lingering knowledge that hesitation was a test kept me alert, awake, and unsteady, aware that I had survived not because I was strong, but because I had been patient. I discovered Rule 5. Never let the crane move when your attention is divided, even for a moment, the hard way, during one of the longest shifts I've ever endured. The wind was calmer that evening, but the rig felt heavier, more insistent, like it was pressing down on my mind as much as the steel cables. I had been answering a message on the radio, half listening to a junior rigger explaining a minor sensor issue, when the crane shifted slightly on its own. My heart jumped, and I froze, realizing that I had already broken the rule before I even noticed it. The unease in my chest was immediate, not just from guilt, but from the stark awareness that divided focus could have consequences I couldn't yet see. I stepped back from the controls, trying to regain composure, but every instinct screamed at me to glance at the monitors while still managing the radio. The crane's subtle sway seemed amplified in my perception, each fraction of movement ringing through the cab with a tension I could feel in my shoulders. I realized that Rule 5 wasn't about multitasking. It was about the fracture of attention itself. Any small lapse created a vulnerability, a space where the cable or the load could exploit the slightest miscalculation. I swallowed hard and turned fully to the crane, ignoring the voice in my earpiece entirely. The junior rigger, still watching from the deck below, called again about the sensor, but I didn't answer, not even with a nod. The rule pressed down on me in ways I couldn't articulate. It demanded undivided observation, complete surrender of perception to the machine. I realized that it wasn't simply mechanical obedience that kept the operation safe. It was my mental alignment with every axis, every tension readout, every subtle hint of imbalance. One misstep, one glance away, and the crane's mood could shift, revealing that it had more autonomy than I wanted to believe. Minutes passed, and the rig hummed around me with indifferent consistency. My hands hovered over the controls, my eyes locked on the cable line, my ears straining to distinguish machine from wind. Every other sound faded into background static. I felt the weight of the rule, an invisible leash connecting me to the crane, reminding me that any fracture of focus could cascade into disaster. The isolation wasn't physical, it was cognitive, a narrowing of attention that made the rest of the rig seem almost unreal. My mind was consumed entirely by steel, cable, and tension. A slight twitch in the load made my pulse spike. I leaned into it, holding the levers steady without action, waiting for the moment to pass. The crane responded subtly, almost predictably, but the tension of anticipation in the cab was enough to make my stomach churn. The minute my eyes flicked toward the corner monitor, just briefly, I felt it. A micro shift, a subtle sway, enough to remind me why the rule existed. It was a tiny infraction, nothing catastrophic yet, but the principle was clear. Divided attention was permission for something unknown to intrude. I replayed the memory over and over in my mind, imagining what could have happened if I had allowed myself to respond to the radio or the rigger's calls. The rule wasn't just a guideline for caution, it was a hard boundary between maintaining control and giving the machine, or whatever influence beneath it, a foothold. I realized that the crane's reactions weren't random, nor were they purely mechanical. They were measured against me, against the focus I could maintain, and the consequences were patient, waiting for moments like mine to exploit. By the time my shift ended, I had memorized the subtle cues of the crane's movements, the almost imperceptible hints that attention must never wander. The rule had reshaped my perception, turning ordinary tremors into meaningful signals, subtle vibrations into warnings, and silence into expectation. Even stepping away from the controls, I could feel the weight of that instruction lingering in my shoulders and in the lines of steel, reminding me that discipline was the only defense. The junior rigger didn't mention my inattention, and I didn't bring it up either. We both knew without speaking that divided attention could have led to disaster we weren't ready to acknowledge. Walking across the deck to the stairwell, I felt the weight of the crane's presence behind me, not mechanical, but cognitive, a lingering reminder that Rule 5 was less about technique and more about the state of mind. Even now, I can feel it, a subtle pull at the edges of perception, insisting that no glance, no question, no distraction could ever be allowed while the crane moved. The lesson burned into me slowly, lingering in my shoulders and the back of my eyes. Attention, total and uninterrupted, was a currency I could not spend lightly. The crane demanded it, and the rig reinforced it with unspoken pressure, subtle shifts and small tremors that warned of the cost of negligence. Leaving the cab, I could feel the memory of that shift etched into my very posture, a constant reminder that divided attention had consequences beyond the visible. Even after months, I could still sense the cable's tiny tremor in my imagination, a reminder that Rule 5 was not optional, it was survival. The first time Rule 6, never override the crane's automated safety lock, without explicit authorization, became more than a warning. I was mid-shift, with a load that had already tested my patience and nerves. The cable hung low over the deck, moving subtly, as if it had a mind of its own, and the lock had engaged, freezing the mechanism before anyone could see a problem. Instinct screamed at me to bypass it, to take immediate control and correct what I perceived as a minor error, but the rule echoed in my head. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the override switch, feeling the weight of every prior mistake pressed down. A small voice, mine or imagined, whispered that disobedience might yield disaster. I couldn't yet name. I swallowed, heart hammering, and waited for someone to confirm permission, even though I knew no one would. The crane seemed to sense my internal debate, its metal frame vibrating ever so slightly, as though testing the sincerity of my restraint. Every instinct I had told me that hesitation could cost me time, efficiency, and the respect of the crew. Yet Rule 6 anchored me in place. I stared at the safety lock's indicator light, green when idle, red when engaged, and realized that obeying the rule required more than discipline. It demanded trust in something I could neither see nor fully comprehend. Minutes passed, and I became painfully aware of my own shallow breathing, each inhalation echoing against the steel walls of the cab. The crane hummed in a way that felt sentient, almost conversational, reminding me why overrides existed, why they were forbidden without authorization. I imagined the consequences of acting impulsively: snapped cables, a swinging load, or perhaps something even worse hidden beneath the water. The rule was about preserving a balance, a subtle negotiation between human impulse and mechanical authority that could not be broken lightly. When the supervisor finally appeared on the deck below, I signaled without words, pointing to the lock and the hesitant tension in the cable. He nodded, the acknowledgement silent but firm, and the moment stretched longer than it should have. Following the rule didn't just prevent accidents, it maintained a fragile control over forces that I could sense, but not quantify. The delay, the restraint, had transformed a routine operation into a careful choreography between instinct and instruction. Even after authorization was granted, my fingers trembled over the switch, hesitant despite confirmation. The crane obeyed my command, as if it had been waiting for the proper recognition, moving smoothly, but with a subtle resistance that reminded me of my own fallibility. I realized then that Rule 6 was not only about safety in the mechanical sense, but about acknowledging boundaries that were invisible yet intensely consequential. Each time the lock engaged, it was a test of patience, a demand to confront my need for immediate control. Later in the shift, I replayed the scenario in my head, noting every twitch of the crane, every micro vibration in the cable, and every heartbeat I had tried to ignore. The rule had embedded itself into my perception, turning caution into a lens through which I filtered every movement. I understood that overriding without permission was more than a mistake. It was a rupture in the rhythm of operations that could have cascading effects beyond comprehension. By the end of the day, the crane rested silently, the safety lock disengaged, but the lesson remained. The hum of the machinery, the subtle tension in the cables, and even the shadow of the deck above, felt like reminders that Rule 6 wasn't negotiable. It demanded patience, humility, and awareness of limits, both human and mechanical. As I left the cab, the memory of that hesitation lingered, an invisible tether reminding me that authority and restraint were inseparable on this rig. The night settled over the rig, with an almost oppressive calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the crane, in its quiet obedience, had learned something about me as well. Every automated system, every lock and gauge, had a purpose beyond instruction. It had a way of revealing my impatience, my impulses, and my disregard for boundaries. Following Rule 6 hadn't just saved the operation, it had kept me from witnessing consequences that I feared but could not imagine, leaving me aware of the fragility of control in a world where machinery obeys rules I barely understand. Even after I climbed down from the cab and walked toward the stairwell, the lingering awareness of the lock's presence stayed with me. It pressed on my shoulders, a silent reprimand, a reminder that control is an illusion unless tempered with patience. I realized that every shift since then had been measured against that singular lesson. The crane, the rig, and whatever waited below were all watching for compliance, for hesitation, and for respect of the invisible lines I had nearly crossed. By the time the lights dimmed for the night, the crane sat inert, obedient, yet somehow sentient in its stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that the machine had cataloged my hesitation, storing it somewhere beneath the steel and oil, waiting for a test I couldn't anticipate. I knew that Rule 6 was not merely instruction, it was survival, a boundary set to separate instinct from consequence, and obeying it had kept me alive when defiance might not have. I learned Rule 7. Never approach the cable from an angle that puts your body between the load and the deck. On a morning that began deceptively calm, with a sky the color of iron and a sea that whispered beneath the rig, the load we were lifting was larger than usual, suspended by a cable that trembled with unseen weight. I misjudged my footing, stepping too close as I tried to guide it with my gloved hands, and felt a subtle shiver travel up through my spine, as if the crane had noticed my misstep. That split second, where my body was perfectly aligned for disaster, made me realize the rule wasn't about technique. It was about respecting invisible margins enforced by the weight itself. The deck beneath my boots seemed narrower than it had moments before, and every step toward the cable felt like crossing a threshold. I could feel the steel plates vibrating faintly under the load, communicating tension through the soles of my boots. Looking down, the shadow of the cable stretched longer than reality allowed, bending in ways that made my stomach knot. I instinctively froze, recalling Rule 7 in that exact instant, the words a lifeline against what my instincts had told me was safe. Moving any closer would have invited catastrophe without warning. I took a step back, carefully, measuring the distance between myself and the load. The junior rigger beside me flinched at the movement, but I ignored his glance, focused entirely on maintaining the correct angle. The crane responded smoothly to the controls, but the memory of stepping too close lingered, like an imprint left in my muscles and reflexes. I realized the rule's purpose was less about visible danger, and more about creating invisible safe zones that protected not just body, but perception, keeping me alert to nuances in weight and swing that only become apparent from the correct stance. The wind shifted slightly, brushing against my face, with the smell of salt and diesel. The load swayed imperceptibly, teasing the limits of both cable and crane, but I stayed positioned safely off-axis, letting the machine dictate its own rhythm. Each minor movement felt intentional, a silent warning etched into the tension of the cable. The deck seemed to whisper in the gaps between mechanical hums, reminding me why proximity and positioning mattered. By following Rule 7, I preserved not just safety but clarity, a mental buffer against mistakes that could escalate before anyone noticed. When the supervisor called down to adjust the load, I complied, careful to remain in the safe angle, letting my hands guide the levers without ever stepping directly under the suspended mass. The crane's frame vibrated faintly with every adjustment, subtle enough to pass unnoticed by anyone not attuned, but loud to me, a constant conversation of weight, steel, and gravity. The rule transformed the way I moved, turning caution into instinct. Even a minor lapse in positioning could have resulted in irreversible consequences, though nothing had yet happened. Later, as the load was finally secured and the shift moved on, I reflected on the near miss. The lesson of Rule 7 wasn't about the mechanics of lifting. It was about awareness of spatial risk, anticipation of the unpredictable sway, and respect for forces beyond human perception. The crane had a memory in its tension, a way of correcting or warning operators who stepped too close, and obeying the rule had kept me out of that feedback loop. I realized how many tiny moments I had overlooked in past shifts, moving too close or underestimating angles, flirting with risk without understanding it. By the end of the day, the deck felt both familiar and alien, the cable resting still but humming softly in a way that reminded me of its presence, of what could happen if boundaries were ignored. Every time I approached the load after that, I measured angles first, calculated shifts in weight second, and let instinct yield to enforced caution. The rule had embedded itself in my muscles, my vision, and my awareness, making every step a test of patience and restraint. Even now, the memory of stepping too close lingers in my chest, a tight knot of adrenaline and understanding. Rule 7 became less about avoiding a direct impact, and more about respecting invisible thresholds that the crane, the load, and the rig demanded. It wasn't taught in manuals, it was enforced silently through consequences and near misses. And though the deck returned to normal after the shift, I could still feel the hum of the cable reminding me to respect angles, to maintain safe distance, and to acknowledge that proximity without care was a mistake I could never afford to repeat. By nightfall, the rig was quiet, but the lesson persisted, etched into every movement and every glance toward the crane. The angles I kept, the distances I measured, and the hesitation before stepping forward became part of the rhythm of work, inseparable from control. The cable, the crane, and the suspended load had a way of testing obedience subtly, and Rule 7 had taught me to respect the invisible lines that separated caution from catastrophe. The first time Rule 8, never trust readings that seem too stable for too long, forced its lesson on me. I was halfway through a night shift, with the ocean spread out below, black and flat, reflecting nothing. The tension gauge had been steady for nearly an hour, the line unchanging, smooth, almost unnaturally perfect. My gut tightened. Instinct told me that perfection in this context was a warning. I glanced at the deck, the junior rigger walking casually beside the suspended load, unaware, and I realized the calm I saw might be the precursor to a disaster waiting for someone careless enough to trust it. The rule wasn't just a caution, it was an alert encoded in the unremarkable, in the absence of fluctuation, and ignoring it could cost more than equipment. I leaned closer to the control panel, tracing my finger along the gauge without touching anything, feeling the subtle pulse that still existed beneath the apparent calm. Everything on the rig obeyed physics, but the weight didn't feel natural. It felt anticipatory. Rule 8 whispered in my memory, warning that machines and loads have ways of hiding tension, storing potential energy in moments that look uneventful. The hum of the crane, the gentle sway of the cable, even the rhythm of the machinery beneath my feet, all suggested a withheld warning. I swallowed hard and refused to relax my grip, refusing to treat stability as safety. Minutes passed, the rig alive in quiet ways I couldn't explain, the cable holding as if frozen by its own awareness. I walked slowly along the deck to check the load's position, eyes flicking to the cable, gauges, and shadows at once. Every minor tremor registered in my senses like a heartbeat, subtle but insistent. The calm readings were deceiving. The crane wasn't defying physics. It was waiting, storing a response for the moment someone misjudged it. I felt the weight of the rule pressing on my chest, more urgent than the physical burden of the load. The junior rigger approached again, pointing out that the readings hadn't changed in half an hour. He shrugged, unconcerned, and I forced myself to nod, though my skin prickled with unease. I reminded myself that Rule 8 existed for moments exactly like this, when complacency could appear as control. The trust I felt toward instruments was fragile, misleading, a potential trap. I continued my inspection, letting my senses override the digital perfection, acknowledging that the real danger wasn't visible, but hidden in the absence of apparent movement. As the shift wore on, I tracked every minuscule fluctuation in the cable, even those that the monitors refused to report. The crane responded to my inputs subtly, but never perfectly, as if negotiating the tension between obedience and anticipation. I felt my mind split into two currents, one interpreting the data, the other watching the machine, watching for deviations too small for any gauge to catch. That dual attention was exhausting, but Rule 8 demanded it. The risk wasn't in failure that could be measured, it was in false confidence that could not be undone. Later, during a lull in operations, I replayed the moments in my head, remembering how smooth the gauge had seemed, how calm the load had appeared. Nothing in the rig screamed danger, yet the quiet insisted on vigilance. The rule had transformed my perception, teaching me to read silence as a warning and stability as suspicion. Even when other crew members laughed over minor mistakes or joked about monotony, I couldn't shake the unease. Following the rule was mental, emotional, and physical, a constant reminder that trust without skepticism was dangerous. By the end of the night, the load was secured, and the cable quiet, but the lesson lingered like static in my bones. Every shift after that, I approached readings with suspicion, questioning stability, cross-referencing movement, and anticipating unseen shifts. The crane, the cable, and the gauges all seemed more alive, more deliberate, reminding me that Rule 8 wasn't optional. I left the rig exhausted, not just from labor, but from attention stretched taut across every subtle signal that instruments alone refused to convey. Even now, thinking back, I can feel the phantom steadiness of that gauge and the creeping doubt it introduced into my perception. Stability itself is deceptive. It can lull the operator into a sense of safety that doesn't exist. The lesson of Rule 8 stays with me. Moments that feel easiest are often the ones that demand the most vigilance, and ignoring them can let consequences quietly gather beneath unnoticed calm. The cable and crane never forget, and neither do I. I learned Rule 9: never enter the crane cab alone during a system alert, even if the warning seems minor, on a night when the rig had settled into a deceptive lull, and the horizon was barely visible beneath the moonless sky. The alert had flickered quietly on the control panel, a small amber light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and instinct pulled me toward it despite the rule. My fingers hovered over the hatch handle as I remembered that previous operators had vanished or been reassigned after ignoring warnings that seemed insignificant. That tiny hesitation, the one I thought I could dismiss, was precisely why the rule existed, a buffer between curiosity and consequence. I opened the cab door slowly, the metal cold against my gloves, and felt the tension immediately. Even without the alert, the air inside was heavier, as if charged by unseen currents of weight and expectation. The gauges were all nominal, but my instincts told me they were lying, not in their function but in what they didn't report. Rule 9 reminded me that presence alone could trigger consequences, that entering the cab during an alert wasn't just a procedural violation, it was an invitation for unknown forces to interact with the operator directly. My chest tightened as I hesitated in the doorway, measuring every breath, every vibration, every whisper of the machinery. The deck below was silent. Crew members moved, as though unaware of the alert, but I could feel the crane's subtle shifts, the cable's slight sway, the way shadows stretched differently when I moved. I stepped fully into the cab, hands gripping the levers cautiously, and reminded myself constantly of the rule. Even the slightest act of ignoring the protocol could escalate tension beyond repair. I checked the panels repeatedly, not because the readings were untrustworthy, they were stable, but because my presence made every number feel alive, deliberate, and capable of change. I muttered to myself, almost as a prayer, as I traced my fingers along the interface. The alert was minor, something routine in the manual, but I could sense layers beneath it, hidden in the hum of the motors, the subtle resonance of the cable, the intangible feel of weight suspended above the deck. The rule demanded caution, patience, and vigilance. Any deviation could allow small anomalies to grow unchecked. I realized that entering the cab alone wasn't dangerous because of the alert itself, but because of the operator's interaction with it. My awareness, inattention, or hubris could invite disaster. Minutes stretched, and I felt the cab shrink around me. Shadows seemed to lean closer, cast by machinery I knew to be inert. My heartbeat echoed in the confines, and every subtle twitch of the cable registered as if it were scrutinizing my choices. The alert pulsed faintly, indifferent to my anxiety, and I could almost hear a rhythm that matched the crane's own awareness. Rule 9 was more than a rule. It was a protective measure that extended beyond mechanics, into perception and presence, forcing operators to acknowledge that the machine, the load, and the environment were intertwined in ways that obedience alone could not mitigate. I considered stepping out, seeking another pair of eyes or hands, but paused, aware that the outside world could not remove the tension generated by my proximity. The cab, the crane, and the suspended load seemed aware of my presence, testing boundaries and waiting. The amber light continued to pulse, a quiet insistence on vigilance, reminding me that the rule was less about protocol and more about survival. Following it required patience, awareness, and humility, the last of which I had only learned through previous missteps. By the end of the alert, the cab and load had returned to normal function, yet I felt as though nothing had truly stabilized. The rule had left an imprint on me. Entering alone, no matter how routine the warning seemed, created a vulnerability that no gauge or procedure could measure. The crew returned, none the wiser, but I remained hyper-aware, replaying every choice, every hesitation, every heartbeat in my mind. The lesson was clear and unyielding. Rule 9 was a safeguard against hubris, an invisible force that protected operators from consequences they might otherwise ignore. Even now, I can feel the tension of that night lingering in my memory, a faint echo in my muscles and in my perception of weight. I understand that entering the cab alone during an alert invites unseen consequences, ones that aren't mechanical failures, but subtle shifts, psychological pressures, and latent threats that measure awareness rather than strength. Rule 9 had transformed my approach to vigilance entirely, teaching me that survival often depends on respect for procedure, anticipation of the invisible, and acknowledgement of forces beyond immediate comprehension. I learned Rule 10. Never ignore the crane's subtle resistance. It's always communicating something vital during a lift that seemed routine at first, the cable stretching taut as if it were a living spine under my command. I noticed it immediately, a hesitation in the lever, a weight that didn't match the load's gauge, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. My first instinct was to override it, to assert control, to make the machine obey my will, but the memory of the rule anchored me. The resistance wasn't a flaw, it was a message, something encoded in tension and motion that demanded recognition. I felt my pulse spike as I slowed my movements, listening, interpreting, trusting. Every small adjustment revealed more layers. The load shifted slightly, the cable pulsed against the crane's frame, and the vibration traveled through the deck into my boots, like a language I was only beginning to understand. Crew members on the deck moved in rhythm with the machine, unaware of the dialogue happening just above their heads. Rule 10 wasn't about safety alone. It was about attention and communication, the subtle negotiation between human intent and mechanical intelligence. I felt the crane testing my patience, my awareness, and my willingness to listen instead of command. Minutes stretched into a tense meditation as I allowed the resistance to guide my actions. Each lever, each subtle counterpressure, became a conversation rather than a set of instructions. Ignoring the resistance would have been easier, more efficient, but the cost could have been catastrophic. A lesson taught in tremors and near misses, I realized that my role wasn't just to lift a load, but to respond, to adapt, to interpret the silent signals in the tension, a language that existed only when I stopped asserting control. The wind shifted, brushing past the cab and bending the load slightly, but the resistance in the lever adjusted automatically, a preemptive caution that my mind barely noticed until I felt the change. I had been approaching the crane as a tool, but the rule reminded me that it was more than that. It was aware, responsive, and demanding of observation. The subtle communications weren't warnings in words. They were shifts, hesitations, the kind of feedback that could be missed if distracted. Every fraction of motion had meaning, and disobedience to it could invite consequences unseen. By the time the lift was complete, sweat clung to my skin and my hands ached, but the lesson was indelible. Ignoring the crane's resistance, I realized, was more dangerous than ignoring any gauge or procedural checklist. It demanded interpretation, respect, and patience, qualities that the rig enforced silently through tension, vibration, and subtle imbalance. Rule 10 had forced me to surrender authority, not out of fear, but out of necessity, teaching me that survival depends on listening to what is never said aloud. Even after I powered down the controls and stepped onto the deck, the memory of resistance lingered in my muscles, a vibration I could feel in my spine and chest. The crane's communication wasn't mechanical, it was perceptual, psychological, almost moral, warning me of consequences beyond immediate sight. I realized that every previous lift where I had ignored micro-resistance had been a lesson I hadn't fully absorbed. Now I moved with the tension, never against it, reading the silent language that governed every cable, every pulley, every suspended mass. As night fell over the rig, I replayed every moment, every micro-adjustment, every tiny tremor in my mind. The resistance was a dialogue, patient but insistent, insisting I respect the machine's intelligence and limitations. Following the rule didn't just prevent accidents, it reshaped the way I moved, breathed, and perceived the rig around me. Each subtle pull or hesitation became meaningful, a signal that survival depended not on brute force or experience alone, but on awareness and humility. Even now I can feel the memory of resistance in every movement I make near a cable or load. Rule 10 has become a guiding principle, a constant reminder that machinery speaks in its own way, and survival requires listening, interpreting, and yielding when necessary. Ignoring it, I know, is no longer just dangerous, it's reckless. And the crane, in its subtle insistence, has taught me that control is an illusion unless paired with comprehension, patience, and attention to the quiet signals that dictate everything above the deck. I learned Rule 11. Never assume the cable's movement is purely mechanical. There's always something else influencing it. On the night the wind dropped, and the sea became a black mirror beneath the rig. The cable twisted slowly, almost casually, though every gauge insisted the load was balanced, and the crane was idle. My first thought was a mechanical glitch, a misreading, but instinct, sharpened by every rule I'd followed before, screamed that something unseen was at work. The rhythm of its motion was deliberate, subtle, intelligent even, and I froze in the cab, gripping the controls with tense awareness, heart hammering as I realized the last lesson wasn't about mechanics at all. Every twitch, every slight sway seemed synchronized to my own movements, as if the cable knew my intentions before I acted. I tried to rationalize: current, wind, imbalance, but the patterns didn't fit any physical explanation I knew. I remembered the junior rigger's distant glance from the deck, the faint hum of the machinery, the slight shiver in the cab floor, and realized the rule existed, because what influenced the cable wasn't always visible or measurable. Even obeying the first 10 rules didn't prepare me for this. It demanded vigilance beyond instruments, beyond logic, beyond experience. I whispered the rule to myself repeatedly as I tracked the load, moving slowly, hesitantly, letting instinct and caution dictate each adjustment. Every command I issued met resistance, not mechanical, not logical, but deliberate. The crane and cable responded in ways I couldn't predict, nudging, pausing, shifting just enough to unsettle me. I realized then that Rule 11 wasn't just about external forces. It was about acknowledging limits, about surrendering assumptions and recognizing that my perception could only grasp part of the truth. Minutes stretched impossibly as the load continued its subtle, almost conscious motion. I could feel tension building, not in the cable alone, but in the space around it, the air thick, charged, almost listening. My pulse quickened as I refused to make sudden adjustments, each second feeling like a negotiation with forces I could not see. The weight of all previous rules pressed down: hesitation, attention, respect for resistance. All were useless unless I accepted that the cable was not solely obeying physics. It was influenced by something else entirely, and survival required acknowledging it. From the deck, shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally beneath the load, bending as if alive, though the rig itself was still. I kept my hands steady, following every twitch with careful observation, and realized the subtle changes weren't random. They were communicative, deliberate, and patient. The rule demanded that I read between motions, trust instincts over instruments, and never assume understanding of what I could not measure. Each sway, each pause, each fraction of movement carried meaning, and ignoring it could unravel everything. Even when the shift ended and the load rested safely, the memory of that night stayed with me. Every movement, every hesitation, every pulse of the crane and cable reminded me that Rule 11 was the culmination of every other lesson. It wasn't about mechanics alone, not about safety protocols, not about attention. It was about respect for forces beyond perception, forces that tested not just skill, but awareness, humility, and vigilance. The cable, the rig, and whatever else lingered unseen beneath the water had reminded me that survival required acknowledgement of the unknown. The night felt impossibly still as I stepped from the cab, boots clanging softly against the deck. Every shadow, every hum, every subtle tension in the cables whispered of presence beyond my comprehension. I realized that Rule 11 didn't promise understanding, only survival for those willing to recognize that influence extended beyond the measurable. Even now, recalling the motion of that cable, I feel the weight of it in my chest, a reminder that obeying rules protects you only so far. The rest depends on vigilance, humility, and acknowledgement of the unseen. The crane rested silently, obedient, but its presence felt alive, patient, and waiting. I knew that the lesson of Rule 11 would haunt every lift, every shadow, every subtle twitch of steel above the deck. Control was an illusion, and the cable, influenced by forces I would never name, had reminded me of my limits. Following the rule hadn't just preserved life, it had opened a door into understanding that some threats are measured not by gauge or gravity, but by awareness, respect, and cautious observation. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.